Okay. Hello. I shall begin. Um, oh, how do I shoot?
Click on the mouse.
Okay. Woohoo. So, last quarter, around February, a bunch of these posters went up on campus, articulating that trans genocide is a reality and that it is impending and worsening problem, tied to fascism. This is not a particularly unusual position. It's not that hard to find people who will agree with this. On the other hand, there are people whose reaction is going to be, well, okay, I recognize that transphobia is very bad and there's structural violence and all that stuff, but sorry, not genocide. This hints at some variation in how genocide is discursively constructed. Meanwhile, genocide studies is just starting to tackle the concept of trans genocide. And a problem that it is struggling with is overcoming that hurdle of the conceptual validity of trans genocide. So, this gives us some problems to figure out. What can trans genocide tell us about genocide discourse? And there is something I think very interesting there. Um, what is going on with trans genocide, like in the present? What can it mean for the future? And what has it looked like historically? And how can we use queer theory to do things to genocide studies and understand genocide discourse? We're going forward with four analyses and a call to action. So here's what's going on with the discourse. There seems to be a somewhat dichotomous way that we vary in how we discursively construct genocide. Um, this is my analysis. Normative genocide is what I'm calling it, is a very normal way of talking about and understanding genocide. It's more or less rooted in the work of Raphael Lemkin and the UN Genocide Convention. So the legal definition, and that means it is legally rooted and involves prosecutable perpetrators for legal purposes. This means that it is genocide intentionally committed by specific people. So there is intent and the experience of genocide perpetration, as well as experiencing genocide on the part of the targeted victims of genocide. There is restricted eligibility. Specifically, that is racial, national, ethnic, and religious groups. And there is a somewhat limited range in the types of violence, more often overt. The degree to which structural violence is conceptually allowed is somewhat limited. Queer genocide, that's what I'm calling it, is resemblant to the tradition of queer theory, which is oriented around the expansion of possibilities. So eligibility itself is expanded such that more types of marginalized communities are eligible for genocide. There does not seem to be a required category of perpetrators or intent, just the experience of being genocided. And that means genocide can be done structurally by society in a somewhat abstract way. This is a theory that can be applied, but also describes actual genocide in society. An analysis that comes to us from the genocide scholar Lily Nellens uses heteronationalism to explain trans genocide historically as well as in the present. So heteronationalism is where heteronormativity is a fundamental component of nationalism. Another way of thinking of it is that nations are like bundles of different normativities for a culture. And in this case, heteronormativity is especially salient. So when nations undergo genocidal episodes, they seek to purge national threats. That includes threats to that nation's heteronormativity. Queer people are seen as threats to heteronormativity and therefore are national threats and are purged through genocidal violence. This explains how queer people, and in this case, trans people, which is entailed, get caught up in genocidal episodes. The Holocaust illustrates this really well because you did have a number of different targets, and that did include trans people being sent to concentration camps for no other reason than being trans. The genocide of the Bisu community in South Sulawesi in the 1960s is also worth noting because that is a genocidal episode that just targeted a third gender category. And I think that is useful historical precedent to bring up. Um, so toxification and securitization can explain how um, it can get worse in the future. This analysis comes to us from Leah Owen. So toxification is a discursive structure of doing bigotry, where the marginalized group in question is rendered analogous to an infectious disease. So there is the nature of the disease, the symptoms, in this case being trans, the location where the infection is happening, in this case, like women's and children's spaces like women's restrooms and school libraries, the target, the supposedly vulnerable communities of women and children, women because trans women are often viewed as predatory, and children because children are viewed as susceptible to indoctrination. So the idea is that trans women are predators, and gender ideology is something that causes transness to be communicable. The response. So securitization is where the state boosts its security power in response to a national threat. This is associated with authoritarianism. A pattern historically in genocides is that the targets of genocide are toxified, and then a securitization is used to do genocide to that toxified group. So we have a toxification narrative targeting trans people, and we have a number of authoritarian governments around the world, including ours. It logically follows that there is a possibility of trans people being the target of securitization using a toxification narrative. Trans genocide could progress more overtly in this way. So for the current structures of genocidal systems, the trifecta of violence is a concept that can help us understand how this works. Basically, that describes an interplay between violent ideology, violent actions, and violent policies that feed into each other. So discourse, what the government does, and then what people do interpersonally and structurally creates genocidal violence. So examples that the structure manifests are hate crimes, so just straight up killing trans people. We are also very much at risk for assault and especially sexual assault. Social death, where people act as though you are dead. Exile, being forced from your home, displaced, like fleeing to another country, sent to the margins of society and becoming homeless, which for trans people is deadly because there is discrimination against trans homeless people, including in Bellingham. Being disowned by your family. Symbolic violence is a form of mental harm, which is noted as a form of genocidal violence, and that includes misgendering, arguably, because that can be very psychologically damaging. Forced and coerced detransition is a way of removing members from the group, and also is incredibly traumatic. That was a feature of the Bisu genocide, forced detransition. Medical apartheid, where trans people are denied access to care, including life-saving care, such as treatment for ovarian cancer in the famous example of Robert Eads, or denial of access to gender-affirming care, which is very trans-specific, and there's a whole lot of systems that go into that. What this all amounts to is probably the most important one, which is genocide-like rates of suicide. There is alarmingly high suicide rates for trans people, especially suicide attempt rates. There is variation in the statistics, but it's alarming. It's genocide if you cause a group to kill itself. That's what's going on. So let's talk about reproductive futurism, because this one I think is really interesting. Genocides target reproductive futurism, which is where a group continues itself generationally through reproduction, having new generations and then enculturating those generations into that group. It can be unclear how trans people are applicable because we do not perpetuate ourselves generationally the way like ethnic groups do. But we can queer reproductive futurism. Coming out is analogous to birth because it is a way of creating new members of the group, and that's the point. So, if these genocidal systems have a dissuasive effect on coming out as trans, or even realizing that you are trans, or finding community, and they do, that is a way of limiting new members of the group and functions like limits on reproductive futurism, which is typical of genocide. And the whole point is the continuation of cultural heritage. Lemkin put a lot of emphasis on cultural heritage. We have cultural heritage that we culturally transmit. Limiting coming out and finding a community is a way of cutting off that cultural transmission. So let's talk a call to action within academia, at least. Lots of calls to action. Let's focus on academia. Genocide studies, as I alluded to, is trying to overcome that theoretical hurdle of the conceptual validity of trans genocide. I think we can use queer theory to help it along. So I talked about queer genocide as a discursive observation, but we can also use it as a theoretical lens for what we think genocide is. Genocide studies can use that theoretical lens to get the ball rolling on trying to understand trans genocide. Um, this way, we can have a queer genocide studies and use academia as a tool of one of many for dealing with this problem. So my call to action to the genocide scholars is to move over into the camp of queer genocide. And that brings us to the questions. I think there probably is more identifiable perpetration than I let on. It's just a larger scale than we're used to trying to wrap our heads around in cases of genocides because effectively what you have is transphobic and cisnormative structures, but you can point to individual like media people and politicians who do a lot of the most consequential things. But the lack of easily pointable people that you could like prevent from doing genocide does make solutions very difficult. So I think solution oriented things would have to be discursive and movement oriented more so than legal and criminal oriented. Ooh, so two things here. One, I'm not as familiar with that, but I can tie it to other things that I didn't include on the slides, but I did write about. Um, Another side of reproductive futurism is that queer people generally, and especially trans people, are often seen as infertile, and that's not exactly true. But I do think there is the potential for eugenics for multiple reasons. One is ideas where it can be genetically transmitted, so you would do eugenics to prevent transness, which I don't think is really how it works, but forced desterilisation of a group targeted for genocide is very much genocidal violence. On the other hand, I think research in like neurological etiologies of transness could lead to eugenics if you think that being trans is something you're born with in the brain. That is something I will have to look more into, and that's a really good question. Oh, that's a really good question. So that reminds me that I am probably more optimistic about this than I think I am. So more trans people are out and finding community and doing like very public trans semiotics. Um, and certain cultures on a smaller scale do have very high rates of like acceptance. Like Western, I feel very comfortable being out. That's not something we had when I was born. Not really. So the fact that we have these growing trends of acceptance where you can safely be yourself means that you do feel more compelled to come out and be trans. And that, I think, at least specifically assists with the reproductive futurism side of trans genocide. but also less suicide. And that comes also from improving access to gender affirming care. And it's looking bad right now, but the general trend over the course of my lifetime has been upward and positive. So it could get better or worse.
Second up, in no particular order, is Adrian Carlson, and her paper is called Comparing Hominid Cranial Morphology to Chapelle-aux-Saints 1.
All right. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm Marianne Brazil. I'm a faculty member here in anthropology. For those of you who don't know me, it is my absolute pleasure to present to you all Adrian Carlson, who is our second student awardee. Adrian was a student in my human evolution class in the fall. And as part of that class, I asked students to select a hominid fossil from our teaching collection here and to actually put themselves in the shoes of a paleoanthropologist and to learn about the process of what it's like to describe and compare and make inferences about that specimen in the context of human evolution. And so I was blown away by the work that Adrian did in their project, their understanding of the literature, the limitations, some of the challenges methodologically, and really sharp critical thinking. So I guess we'll hand off the award first, and then I will hand it off to them to tell you more about their project.
Congratulations.
Oh, yeah.
We'll reconstruct.
Cool. Okay. Okay. I'll just stand off. Okay, here we go.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Adrian, and my research project was on comparing hominid cranial morphology to Chapelle-aux-Saints 1, which is a Neanderthal. And then before I get into my actual research, I wanted to provide a brief overview on Neanderthals and my specimen, Chapelle-aux-Saints 1. I like to say that Neanderthals covered a range from Siberia to Iberia. I like that because it rhymes. But basically, they lived across a massive range of environments, both spatially and temporally. Based on available fossil evidence, it seems like they preferred living in and around rock shelters, cave mouths, temperate woodland and grassland environments. They lived in small, pretty isolated communities and tended to occupy the same habitats as their primary food sources. But they also tended to persist in the same areas and regions over long stretches of time. And despite this apparent tendency towards like specific environments, Neanderthals were still a very highly environmentally adaptable species. They lived in, of course, varying climates over space and time with a variety of resources that, again, depended on space and time. And that led to a very varied diet. Classically, Neanderthals are presumed to have been primarily carnivorous, getting all or most of their food from large and medium herbivores. But certain populations may have exploited marine and or plant resources as available. And again, that depends on spatiotemporal availability. And this picture right here is Bouffia Bonneval, which is where my specimen, Chapelle-aux-Saints, was discovered near the village of Chapelle-aux-Saints. And then before I go to the next slide, of course, there's a very pervasive idea that Neanderthals were built the way that they were because they were primarily adapted to cold weather and cold environments. But the environmental variability experienced by them, again, Siberia to Iberia and across roughly 350,000 years of existence, kind of calls into question that cold adaptation theory. Some researchers have argued that this body plan was perhaps better suited to burst or ambush hunting. So they would go and like rush out, kill whatever large or medium herbivore they were hunting, and that their very stocky build was better suited to that than surviving a very cold environment. As far as I know, the jury is still out. I haven't seen anything that is definitively one way or the other. But I think that the massive variety in spatiotemporal environments means that both might be true. Okay, and then here's my guy, Chapelle-aux-Saints 1, who I will refer to as LCS1 from now on. He was a member of Homo neanderthalensis, which again existed from roughly 400,000 to 40,000 years ago. He was first publicized by Marcel Boole in 1911, just under 60 years after the type specimen for Homo neanderthalensis was discovered in Neander Valley, Germany. He was discovered, like I said, near the village of La Chapelle-aux-Saints, hence his name. His remains consist of a partial skeleton and a near complete cranium, as you can see with Boole's original 1911 stereograph right here. He had signs of significant osteoarthritis, tooth loss, and a possible brucellosis infection. And the state of the remains, as well as the osteoarthritis and general health problems, impacted the way Boole reconstructed La Chapelle-aux-Saints. He reconstructed the skeleton using plaster as stand-in for missing elements, and as a result created what is basically the stereotypical representation of Neanderthals we see now, as very like a jutting forward head, like hunched over, kind of knuckle dragging on the ground. And that representation and that reconstruction has heavily impacted the way anthropologists and the broader public have perceived Neanderthals since La Chapelle-aux-Saints' discovery. He was estimated as male based on the auricular surface of the ilium, so where the ilium connects to the sacrum at the back of the body, as well as tooth attrition. And he was, on all the papers that I read, the ages that he was estimated as ranged from 40 to 70.
So now the microphone is living in there.
Okay, awesome.
We're gonna get this out of here.
Stand in the middle, Judy.
Oh, and I'm so sorry. I'm supposed to stand in the middle here. Am I supposed to stand? No, you're supposed to stand. Okay, I'm not
We
good
can
at
do
text.
this one a couple times.
I'm really not good at text.
Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Here's the mouse.
It should. If you go up to a slideshow. Yeah. So
Click on the
Yeah.
main part of the screen.
there. There.
Okay, awesome. So today I'll be talking about Paleo-Maori language revitalization and specifically on mediating dominant language ideologies. But before I start, I do want to give a land acknowledgement. This comes from the university's official website, but I do like the way it's written. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather here today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Additionally, I want to take this time to thank the Chickasaw Nation, the Western Apache community, the Maliseet community, and the Shoshone community. It's through their, and the Navajo community. It's through their scholarly collaboration that I was able to do this project in the first place. The region I like to focus on is the Oceanic region. And unfortunately, it has been a bit underrepresented in scholarly work. So I can use the work that Indigenous communities are doing over here to make parallels. So I'm very, very grateful for the work that they're doing. And then we're just going to start off with a brief history on how Maori became an endangered language, and then we're going to go into the dominant language ideologies. In the broader New Zealand population, the dominant ideologies are biculturalism and neo-traditionalism, while in the Maori speaker community, it's linguistic purism and linguistic openness. And then we're just going to end off with a call for further research. So in 1840, the Maori people and British settlers signed the Treaty of Waitangi. In return for governance over the land, the Crown promised to protect Maori culture and way of life. However, just 27 years later, they began implementing assimilationist policies with the creation of the Native Schools Act. The Native Schools Act required all Maori children to attend these governmental schools where they were instructed solely in English and prohibited from speaking their ancestral language. And if they were caught, they would be severely punished. The environment in these schools mirrored what was happening in the Indigenous boarding schools in the US and Canada. So to protect their children and like give them a better chance of survival in these schools, some Maori parents began limiting Maori language usage in the home. By 1945, New Zealand gained independence, and by the 1950s, they began enacting urbanization policies, which forced Maori individuals outside of their iwis, which are villages where they live with like their extended family. It's like a giant kinship community, but they were forced into the urban sector, which was dominated by Peka, who are New Zealanders of European descent. So to survive in that new environment, they had to assimilate, start using English more, and language suppression also increased during this time. Parents wanted their children to acquire English instead of Maori, as it would offer them better economic opportunities in the future. By the 1970s, Richard Bentham released a language acquisition survey in which he found that only approximately 5% of Maori kids knew how to speak the Maori language. This raised alarm bells in the Maori community, and they began with grassroots language revitalization programs. During this time, there was also a lot of Maori activism for the government to recognize the Treaty of Waitangi and actually preserve Maori culture and way of life. By 1987, the government listens, well, they agree that Te Reo Māori is one of the official national languages, and they put it up to the same level as English, the dominant settler language. And throughout the 80s and 90s, they begin implementing a lot of Maori language revitalization efforts. However, despite all the efforts, which I am going to get into a little bit later, Maori acquisition still remains low. But according to surveys conducted by anthropologists Albury and Jerusalem, the youth really want to learn the language. They just don't have access to consistent, accurate language learning materials. So if non-native children and Maori children want to learn the language, why isn't the government listening and honoring the treaty? I argue that to get a hegemonic entity like the government to listen, we need to mediate the dominant language ideologies that already exist. So we're going to start off with biculturalism, but I think it would be helpful if I define what a language ideology is. Woolard puts it way better than I ever could. So language ideologies are morally and politically loaded representations of the structure and use of languages in a social world. They link language to identities, institutions, and values in all societies. So biculturalism is the coexistence of two distinct cultures where individuals of both cultures can be accepted and participate in the other party's culture. In a nutshell, it is unity without the need for assimilation. And in New Zealand, it's displayed through propping Maori up to the same level as English by making it an official language, implementing Maori signage in public sectors. It was really hard to find pictures of this. A lot of people don't take pictures of signs, so yeah. And then the implementation of a Maori broadcasting service so everyone in New Zealand can tune in and hear Maori for themselves. And Maori is also highlighted in significant national events like parliamentary hearings. This picture is actually of a pauhiri, which is a Maori welcoming ceremony. And the government also mandated that some Maori be taught in primary school, and as well as the youth's desire to learn the language. The benefits of this language ideology is that it creates unity and a shared identity for all New Zealand citizens, especially under the term Kiwi. But the recognition of the term Kiwi has to encapsulate Maori culture and heritage as well. But there are a lot of drawbacks as well. There's some Maori activists who really don't like the heavy signage in public sectors because they feel as though language acquisition rates are so low, yet the government is making it look like this is a bilingual state when it's not. And they're like, well, why can't they put that funding elsewhere? And additionally, it just lulls the broader New Zealand community into believing that language revitalization has happened. And also, despite the youth's desire to learn the language, they choose not to because it's not guaranteed to be offered throughout their schooling career. And the materials that are available to learn Maori are often in worse condition than language learning materials for other classes, or they just don't learn another language in general, which reinforces the monoglot standard that you only need English to survive, when that's not the case. And on the opposite side of the spectrum is neo-traditionalism. The neo-traditionalism ideology believes that language revitalization efforts should solely be the responsibility of the endangered language community, with no involvement of outside forces. This actually has a lot of merit. The grassroots revitalization programs that I was talking about in the 70s were the Kohainga Rouse, which are really cute. They're called language nests, like they're known as language nests. And it's where children who are too young to go to traditional schooling are cared for and instructed solely in Maori by Maori elders. So it's really great for language acquisition. And also, Maori linguists developed this model for language acquisition and maintenance called the ZEPA model. And the purpose of the ZEPA model is, well, the scale is 0, passive, and active. So individuals on the 0 side of the scale do not support language revitalization, while passive, they do support it, but they aren't involved. And active is members who are really involved. So the whole push of this model is like a rightward shift, getting people from 0 to passive and passive to active. And the benefits are that grassroots initiatives are historically more successful in reversing language shift. The Chickasaw community is having a renaissance at the moment, and it's completely run by the tribe itself. It has no influence from the federal government. And the ZEPA model is being adopted in some schools, and it really helps community accountability, because your child can't go to the school if the parent, regardless of whether or not they know how to speak Maori, they have to be involved in their child's like language acquisition events. They need to show up, volunteer, and yeah, so it really fosters community accountability to maintain language. However, there's also some hindrances to this, as the Maori speaker population is small and not everyone is involved in language revitalization efforts. And additionally, there's no central funding entity for the Maori population. So funding is already a big issue. We would need, it's just not feasible for language revitalization on a national scale to be placed in the hands of such a small population, especially when in their treaty, they were granted the right to preserve their culture. So how do we mediate the continuum? Well, I think that neo-traditionalism is very important, and Maori elders and Maori-led revitalization entities should be at the forefront of these efforts. But, you know, non-Maori individuals need to be involved as well. And the ZEPA model I was talking about earlier encapsulates the entire New Zealand population and not just Maori communities. Additionally, Maori people want they want all New Zealanders to know their language. They are not preventing anyone from learning it. So within the Maori speaker community, one of the ideological camps that people fall into is linguistic purism. This is where speakers do not want any change to the language, like it's just the full preservation of the language as they know it. And this is beneficial because linguistic purists are usually Maori elders, and they have knowledge of key cultural terms that are used to index identity to other Maori individuals. This similar phenomenon, there's no like direct translation to those terms. In English, you wouldn't have like a direct translation. And a similar phenomenon is seen with the Navajo community. Their language is very descriptive, and it's difficult to get the full nuance of terms from Navajo into English without, it's just not possible, the constraints of the English language. And they're also proponents for standardizing Maori. Right now, there's kind of an issue with instructors going into iwis and teaching Maori and not knowing proper grammar. So the knowledge that the lessons they're teaching are just not accurate. But there are hindrances. Maori is not a homogeneous language. There are several dialects, and they're geographically separated, the dialects. And some of the key cultural terms include geographical terms that would be that would just be erased if Maori were to be standardized. And it can also lead to the ahistority for Maori individuals. In English, we create new slang, we use old words for something else. And Indigenous communities should have the same right afforded to them and not lose their indigeneity per se because their language is evolving. And then on the opposite end of that spectrum is linguistic openness. So speakers that fall into this camp believe that existing terms should be adopted to fit into what's happening in the world, and a new term should be added when necessary. And the benefits to this is, I had so much fun researching this, the term takitapui, and it affirms the LGBTQIA plus Maori community specifically. It's a way for Maori individuals to not only like express their ethnic identity, but also their gender identity and sexualities. And it also indexes that they've been here since time immemorial as well. Takitapui has been a word in Maori for a long time. So they're not new, yeah. And originally Takitapui meant a close friend of the same sex, but it later evolved into this movement. And it creates a supportive and open environment to learn Te Reo Māori. They believe there's no correct way to speak Maori, like there's no correct way to speak Chickasaw. But there are hindrances. Like I said, there is like still proper grammar associated with Maori. So if that's not being learned, that's not very good. And then how do we mediate the continuum? I think linguistic purists should be at the forefront. They know all the like key cultural terms, and they can make accurate learning materials that could be disseminated to future teachers especially. And I'm hoping they could collaborate with individuals from other dialects to create multiple forms. And linguistic openness, I think you need people who are open to foster a supportive learning environment, and that can aid in student retention. Linguist Lothar was working with the Shoshone community, and he noticed that a lot of Shoshone kids believed that because they were Shoshone, they would have an easier time acquiring the language, but that's not the case. And they felt like their Indigenous status was like it was just an identity issue. It caused an identity issue when they didn't learn the language as fast as they wanted to, and then they would leave the program. And this is known as the genetic fallacy. So having a supportive environment where it's neither right or wrong and not very like constrained can help in retention. And then a call for future research. As I mentioned, the oceanic region is underrepresented and there's not a lot of current ethnographic research. Ethnographic research is important because it gives us a snippet of what's actually happening in the Maori community. Like currently, a lot of the ethnographic research that has happened was during the 80s when the Maori Renaissance was happening. And right now it's really important because the Treaty of Waitangi is being re-examined by Parliament. I also had a video, but, oh, there it is, okay. I love this video and you guys have probably seen it, but I will play it again. Will the audio work?
This is the motion be agreed to. Those in favour will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it. We're in the middle of a vote. We're in the middle of a vote.
Mr. Speaker, I call that a personal vote.
Don't sit down. We're in the middle of a vote. The ayes have it. The party vote's been called for.
Mr. Speaker.
A party vote's been called for. There's a process here.
New Zealand National.
49 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes opposed.
Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand.
15 votes opposed.
Act New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand First.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori. E ono ngā pōti e whakahe.
Yeah, I love that video, so we had to watch it. And then, thank you for listening. I really appreciate your time. Sorry, it's really small.
You want to get a question in here? I know very late in the day, but I wanted to ask, and I think we have time for questions. What, and this is a question I asked earlier, somebody else too, where do you see the role for linguists and linguistic anthropologists and ethnographers? And how do we avoid the problem of writing in as white saviors? What is the path that you see forward for those of us who are not part of the community but want to bring those skills?
Yes, I definitely think scholarly collaboration, which benefits the Indigenous community that you're working with. I don't think it could be one-sided. Whatever you are working on, it has to help the community in some way, whether it's through the creation of language learning materials or like volunteering even. You have to help. I mean, no one likes uninvited guests who are just there to study them. Yeah. Any other?
Do you know where the Maori is taught? Is it taught as just a language class or is it integrated into other parts of the learning?
Well, that's another big issue. The mandated primary school learning can range from a word a day or like weekly 15-minute sessions. So there's no regulation on that as well, which is unfortunate. Yeah.
You think there's another entrance for revitalization for the language, maybe in a familial sense, because of course we have younger generations wanting to learn the language.
Yeah.
Maybe older generations who also don't know or haven't.
Yes.
You think there's an entrance there?
Oh, definitely there is an entrance. Especially with the ZEPA model, parents have to be involved in their child's language acquisition journey, regardless of their speaker status. And for parents who do want to learn, there are schools available, like classes available, but there's not many available. So that's the issue, is just having these classes be more accessible for everyone and be accurate in what they're teaching. Yeah. Any other question? Oh, yeah.
Do you think with modern technology that allows more accessibility to people to learn the Maori language?
I think so, but I definitely think there's value in learning in person. So I don't think you can get the full nuance of the Maori language through like a Duolingo app, unfortunately. Yeah.
Is there a Te Reo Maori Duolingo?
I didn't think, one time I was wanting to learn Hindi on Duolingo and I saw that they had like Dothraki, but not Hindi. So I was like, oh, okay. That's the vibes, I guess. Yeah.
Very nice, thank you.